might ask, why are we calling it the Angela site? I think you guys understand that, right? We're trying to reorient the narrative to get away from, right? We're trying to give agency to the first Africans, in which none of that is in our history books. It's very upsetting for my 12-year-old to come to me with his SOL questions. This really happened. He said, "Dad, why is there nothing about first Africans of substance?" So people say, are you guys going to find Angela? We're not here to find her. We have found a graveyard that dates to that first quarter of the 17th century. The reason this site is so important is one of the first Angolans in English North America lived here on this site, and just focusing on the archaeology of first Africans is absolutely critical. We spent 25 years digging the site where the English were, and now it's high time for our nation to be excavating a site that is a founding narrative for much of our country. I think people think we're going to find Angela or find something from Angola, and that's likely not the case. But how did Angela impact the household? How did she change foodways, medicine? All those we can learn through archaeology.
For our summer course, it's really significant for students who are often used to one narrative of history, and so to come out here, it helps them think more broadly about American history instead of just the textbook story that they're used to. They're thinking about different people. They're thinking about how we learn history, not just from the records, but from archaeology, material culture, different methods of studying history.
So that's what we're trying to do, trying to contextualize that lost landscape of James City, in which Angela and many, many other diverse peoples were acting out their lives in this landscape. That's all we're doing.